The concept of sustainable development has been around since the late 1980s, but I think for a lot of people over that time it's been seen as just another way of expressing this historical choice between, on the one hand, pursuing efforts towards more economic growth whilst balancing environmental damage on the other. And this kind of, on the one hand, we have people-friendly development, on the other we have birds, fish and nature. And always, when one looks at it through that particular prism, you see that nature is often the loser. The discussion has moved on recently, however, and I think now we're getting into a much more interesting space about what sustainability might mean. And I think for me, one of the most interesting discussions is about seeing this as really the process of improving human well-being within the capacities of the planet. And I think once one starts delving into what human well-being is all about, you can see that there's plenty of evidence now telling us that actually there's only a certain amount of material consumption that we need to deliver a basic level of happiness. And then beyond that, really, we're over-consuming to the point where we're unnecessarily causing major environmental damage. And for me, this idea of happiness and well-being being at the core of how we proceed is a very, very interesting idea for the tourism industry in particular, because this is its basic selling proposition, the idea of happiness and well-being. And I wonder if we might find ways to harness the huge communications reach of the travel and tourism industry to be talking about this different way of looking at the world, rather than simply seeing everything through the lens, as we do now culturally and economically, of material consumption being our benchmark for success. So I think this is quite an opportunity in the sense of being able to communicate to a mainstream audience some different values about what tourism is all about. I think overconsumption is really an expression of how much stuff you're using up. So I think taking 3 holidays a year or 4 holidays a year is absolutely fine if you have a low environmental impact coming from that. Flying across the world 4 or 5 times a year might be more challenging if one starts to look at personal carbon budgets as the way in which we measure how well we're doing. And, you know, in the future, it's very likely that we'll all be down to like something around 1 tonne of carbon per piece. At the moment, in Western Europe, we're more at like an average of 10, 12 tonnes a piece. And of course, many of us are using far more than that because we're taking lots of flights. So this isn't really a question of how much one goes on holiday. It's much more an impact of the act of going on holiday. And I think this is where the industry has got such a huge potential for making major transformations. And, you know, one of the places where, of course, we're going to find it difficult in the near term in terms of technology is the aviation sector. There are new aircraft coming on, they are more efficient, they're cleaner, they're better, and over time we will hopefully have some breakthroughs that will lead us to having pretty much zero carbon aviation. That's a long time in the future. But in the meantime, there's a great deal that can be done on the ground, and I think some countries, like the Maldives for example, that are already embarking on a journey to zero carbon national policies, they would make excellent partners for the industry to be looking at how we could go zero carbon on the ground, looking to go zero carbon in the air later on. For example, I think there's an enormous amount of leadership out there now, people building businesses that are not only socially responsible but also having a far lower environmental impact. That's obviously an inspiration to the wider industry, and some of those individuals and some of those businesses will be celebrated here this morning in the Responsible Tourism Awards. But I think the big challenge now, and where we need to see some real leadership, is to find some of the mass market actors beginning to put across greener tourism, responsible tourism, as something which applies to the wider market, rather than simply those people who would choose green tourism options because they happen to be green. So there is quite a step now needed, and I think some real leadership there to show how this can be a mass market offering, I think would be a real breakthrough. 1 or 2 companies are beginning to show this, but I think if they can build their brands in a way where they're showing that this isn't scary, it's not putting people off, but actually bringing people in, then I think that will start to change the whole industry. Some of the big brands out there now are starting to talk in these terms, but I think if they can harness their marketing reach for this to be the main offer they put across, then I think we'll start to see a repositioning of the whole industry. And in 15 years' time, we could be in a very different place. And I think the world's going to be in a different place anyway. And so leadership in this space is not only, I think, an act of moral responsibility, it's also about anticipating where the world inevitably is going in terms of technology, science, public awareness, and of course the way legislation and policy are moving. Perhaps tourism, more than almost any other industry, has a great opportunity for being able to put across these ideas in a subliminal way. And I don't think we have to see all of the big brands going out there and saying we offer sustainable holidays, but it's more about showing the kind of time you will have, and not necessarily talking about the environment or social well-being, but finding ways in presenting that set of values as part of the aspirational package that people want to buy into. And I think that's something there for the creative people as well as the people putting together the actual holiday products. Governments have a responsibility alongside the aircraft manufacturers and the tour operators in making sure that the aviation sector embarks on a journey towards lower impact. Air passenger duty is one of the tools that's been deployed in this country to send a signal to the aviation industry about the need for cleaner travel. I wonder, however, if this is being used in the best possible way at the moment, not least in terms of how it's sending a signal to the wider population about environmental goals being used to justify general taxation rather than being seen as genuinely green taxation. And one of the things I would like to see is those kinds of green levies that are put on different industries, whether it's air passenger duty in the air or whether it's fuel duties on the ground. I'd like to see those revenues much more obviously driven back into being part of the solution. And so at least part of that APD I would like to see going towards an upgrading of high-speed rail so that we could be reducing the number of short-haul flights in the air at least, and also going towards technology development so we can start to leapfrog some of these next stages of aviation technology to get much closer to zero carbon aviation much quicker. I spent much of my career working at Friends of the Earth, where one of the big priorities for us was to get ecological taxation on the agenda to be debated and then turned into specific policies. We were successful in a whole range of ways in terms of fuel duties, air passenger duty, landfill taxes, aggregate levies. The idea did get some mainstream traction, but the fear I have today, looking back at what's been achieved on ecological taxes in this country, is that we haven't necessarily seen the read across into solving environmental problems beyond a simple blunt price signal. And what we could have done is see much more of those revenues being more obviously put into part of the solutions to high resource and high carbon living. And I think that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been an awful lot of political support for these kinds of taxes, because they have been seen quite rightly as part of general taxation rather than a new style of green taxation. I think the aviation industry, alongside other industries, have to acknowledge that an historic point has been reached where they need to not only be lobbying against things they don't like, which is the historic position of industry when it comes to policy making, but also to be part of the solution in dialogue with governments and saying, well, if we don't think air passenger duty will work, what do we think will work? And the aviation industry for years, in the international climate negotiations at EU level, in domestic circumstances like the United States, has been pretty much against everything. And so what we now need to see is, beyond some of the very welcome technological developments that are coming through with aircraft like the 787 and the A380, we need to see a step change in that level of dialogue with governments. Because if the climate science is believed by industrial sectors, and it now by and large is, we basically need to be going zero carbon by 2050. What's the aviation sector going to contribute to that over that period, recognising that it has been, hitherto, a sector that's been pretty immune to the kind of regulation that's been applied to power stations, to factories, to cars, and of course the tax regime that's been used on the ground to encourage cleaner travel. So I think a lot of people say, okay, well, we understand your case in not liking this, but if you don't like that, what do you want instead? And engaging with policymakers on that basis, I think, would be very welcome. I think the airline industry, and it's been championed by companies like Ryanair, not only have they said that we don't like the policies, they've also gone out and said we don't actually believe there's a problem. That's irresponsible behaviour, I think, in the modern circumstances, and I think the aviation industry would do well to get itself organised into a much more credible, much more forward-looking, much more positive industry force to give the kinds of policies and measures across to policymakers that will actually solve this problem. Because the simple fact is, we don't have enough atmospheric space to keep on growing every fossil fuel using sector, and that is the situation that we're in right now. Coal wants to defend its interests, cars want to defend their interests, we have gas and oil industry still prospecting for more fossil fuels, and we have the aviation industry assuming that its future is based upon continuing growth. We can't accommodate all that growth. We need big solutions from all sides, and I would be very pleased to see the aviation sector's view of what it will look like in the 2030s, 40s and 50s, alongside an 80% cut in emissions globally, which is what we need. The challenge now is to move beyond the historically kind of prevalent anti-lobbying, defensive lobbying against things that industry don't like, and to get into a position where there are credible proposals that are equal to the task being put across with a common and united voice. And that's obviously difficult when you have companies like Ryanair still saying that there's not even a problem. I think in the absence of any other visible signals coming from policymakers, taxation is one route in which you might be able to incentivise greener behaviour. I think probably we should be looking at taxation on aircraft rather than on passengers as a way of incentivising both the cleaner aeroplanes being brought forward and also for the ones that are being flown to be flown full. And so I think the incentives need to be deployed in that way. I think also if you're going to tax a sector because it's not green, then it would be sensible to spend the tax revenues on making it greener. And I think there's more that could be done there. But I don't necessarily take the view that tax is good and every other measure is bad. I think what we need is a decarbonisation of aviation alongside everything else. And if we're going to do that, we need credible policies and measures to do it. And if the aviation sector has got a better way of doing it, then let's hear about it and see if it stands up to the kind of scrutiny that we need in making this transition to an effectively zero carbon world. I think we will have gone through a transition whereby we are joining up the economic aspirations of destination countries and resorts with the needs of the people who are travelling there for relaxation, inspiration and development, with the needs of the communities and the cultures that are hosting them, in a way where we're harnessing the very best of technology to minimise the environmental impacts to as near zero as possible. Part of that is about technology. I think part of it is also going to be about the aspirations and the wishes of the travelling public. And I think, every scientific report I've ever read tells us that we can't all expect to be living like Westerners now live in 2050. We'll be living very differently. I think we could be living extremely well, but we're going to need some real leadership to get us into that place where technology and culture are harnessed together to genuinely deliver some sustainable outcomes. But I think tourism could be at the heart of this because it is right there at the point where people's aspirations are reflected in the idea of happiness, which is, I think, one of the most powerful ideas that's now being developed through sustainability thinking.